Aurora entered the room like a whispered promise of the universe, exuding an irresistible allure with every step, every glance, every fleeting smile. Her beauty wasn't just skin-deep, it was a symphony of mystery and quiet confidence that commanded attention as effortlessly as the sun draws planets into its orbit. But tonight, there was something different about her. An almost supernatural energy woven into her every movement, her every breath. Aurora didn't merely capture attention, she made the room pause, as though everyone present was witnessing something extraordinary, something beyond comprehension. Tonight, she wasn't just a captivating woman, she was a flame. And everyone around her, drawn by her light, was helplessly entranced like moths to a fire. Her beauty was not just in her appearance but in the way she moved, spoke, and occupied space, exuding a quiet confidence that seemed to ensnare anyone who crossed her path. But tonight, there was something distinct, almost ethereal, about her. The air seemed charged, as if the universe itself had taken notice of her. It wasn't just the others in the room who saw it, Aurora felt it, too. Something fundamental had shifted within her. A spark that threatened to ignite a fire she hadn't realized was smoldering. The evening unfolded in an ambience of effortless elegance as Aurora and her husband, Mason, stepped into the grand home of his old college friend. The party was a perfect balance of sophistication and indulgence, glasses of amber whiskey clinking against crystal, the low hum of a jazz band playing in the background, and the subtle yet intoxicating mix of designer perfumes that mingled in the air. Laughter and conversation ebbed and flowed like a tide, creating an intoxicating symphony that enveloped the guests. Mason, ever the charming host, guided Aurora through the room, introducing her to old friends and acquaintances. His hand rested lightly yet firmly on the small of her back, a gesture that spoke volumes. It was protective, yes, but also possessive, as if to silently declare to the room that Aurora was his. Yet, as the introductions went on, she noticed something peculiar in the way his friends looked at her. Their gazes lingered just a beat too long, their eyes carrying a mixture of admiration and something more primal, something that made Aurora's pulse race. For her part, Aurora was accustomed to drawing attention, but tonight it felt amplified. The glances were sharper, the smiles more suggestive, and the room itself seemed to vibrate with an undercurrent of tension that was both thrilling and unnerving. And then Mason, with the ease of someone fully aware of the effect his wife had on others, said something that altered the trajectory of the evening. "Aurora could charm anyone here," he remarked, his tone light, almost teasing, but layered with an undeniable edge. The words hung in the air like a challenge, an invitation that the men in the room seemed to understand instantly. She could feel their attention intensify, the laughter around her softening as a silent pact seemed to form among them. Mason's comment wasn't just a compliment, it was a spark, one that set the entire evening ablaze. As the hours passed and the whiskey continued to flow, the atmosphere took on a dangerous edge. Conversations that had started as light-hearted banter morphed into flirtatious exchanges, each laced with an undercurrent of innuendo that seemed aimed directly at her. Aurora felt the pull of it all. The attention, the danger, and the intoxicating thrill of being the center of everyone's world for the night. The games began innocently enough, classic party games meant to break the ice, but they quickly veered into more suggestive territory. It started with a harmless truth or dare, laughter bubbling as the participants tested each other's boundaries. But when the dares turned toward Aurora, the room grew quieter, the energy sharper. "Aurora, "I dare you to kiss someone who isn't Mason," one of the men challenged. His tone playful but his eyes serious. Her heart thundered in her chest. A mix of excitement and apprehension gripping her. She glanced at Mason, expecting to see disapproval. Perhaps even anger. But what she found instead was something far more disconcerting, a subtle smirk. A raised eyebrow. And an unspoken challenge in his eyes. He wasn't going to stop her. The kiss was electrifying. A fleeting moment that carried the weight of transgression and the thrill of the forbidden. When her lips met another's, time seemed to pause. It was exhilarating, frightening, and deeply, shockingly liberating. She could feel the room's collective breath catch. The energy shifting palpably as the boundary between playfulness and something far darker blurred. That kiss marked a turning point. The dares grew bolder. The stakes higher. And Aurora found herself spiraling into a world she had only ever fantasized about. The attention was intoxicating. The thrill of stepping over boundaries she'd once held sacred sending adrenaline coursing through her veins. Each glance, each touch, each whispered remark pulled her deeper into the night's seductive spell. Mason watched her, his eyes never leaving her. There was no anger in his gaze. But there was something else, a dangerous mix of pride, jealousy, and fascination. It was as if her transformation, her willingness to step into this unknown realm, was as much for him as it was for herself. His presence, his silent approval, emboldened her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The room seemed to close in around her as the night reached a fever pitch. Every move she made was met with rapt attention. Every word she spoke carrying weight it hadn't before. Aurora felt like a queen commanding her court. The men circling her like moths drawn to a flame. She was no longer just Mason's wife. No longer just a beautiful woman at a party. She was a force. A woman on the brink of discovering parts of herself she hadn't dared to explore. And as the evening stretched on, Aurora knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never be the same. What unsettled her most? What turned her stomach and sent shivers cascading down her spine? Was Mason's silence, that heavy, deafening silence. It wasn't the silence of indifference or confusion, but rather, a chilling tacit approval that spoke louder than any words could have. Aurora's heart clenched with a fear that transcended mere discomfort or shame. It was a primal terror. The kind that made her question the very ground she stood on. Mason was there. Always there. A shadow in the periphery. His dark, brooding eyes fixed on her. He observed everything. Every humiliation. Every violation of her personal boundaries. Yet he said nothing. Not a word of protest. Not a single indication that he would step in and stop what was rapidly spiraling out of control. The game had begun innocently enough, a playful, slightly risque evening meant to push comfort zones and tease inhibitions. But now, it had mutated into something unrecognizable. Something grotesque. And Mason's silence. His passive acceptance of the escalating audacity of his friends, was the worst part of it all. It was his silence that truly unraveled her. More than any touch or any dare. Every time her eyes darted to him, silently pleading for intervention, she was met with that same inscrutable expression. His face was a mask. Devoid of emotion but brimming with unspoken intent. A cruel satisfaction simmering just beneath the surface. As the night wore on, the dares grew bolder. Stripping away not just her clothing but her sense of self. It wasn't just her body they undressed, it was her dignity. Her identity. Her soul. The moment came when she was dared to bare herself completely. To stand before them, exposed. Vulnerable. Reduced to nothing more than an object of their collective hunger. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest. Her mind conjured images of escape. Of defiance. Of reclaiming control over her body and her choices. But something stronger. Darker. Held her in place. Fear. Shame. And, to her horror, a faint flicker of exhilaration that she couldn't quite extinguish. Her trembling hands moved as if possessed by some external force, pulling away the last shreds of modesty. A silence heavier than any words descended upon the room. Aurora felt their eyes on her, devouring her, consuming her in ways that transcended the physical. Their gazes were predatory, stripping her of whatever fragments of self-respect remained. The shame burned her skin. But underneath it all, a dangerous thrill coursed through her veins. A heady cocktail of fear and forbidden excitement that made her knees weak and her heart pound. She stood there, naked not just in body but in spirit. A fragile silhouette under the harsh scrutiny of their stares. Mason's friends circled her like vultures, their touches growing bolder, more possessive. Each caress was a declaration, a claiming of territory that was never theirs to claim. Through it all, Mason remained a silent sentinel, his gaze unwavering, his satisfaction growing more evident with every passing moment. He watched her humiliation unfold with an intensity that made her blood run cold. This was no accident. This was orchestrated. This was his design. It was only when she met his eyes, searching for answers, for some semblance of humanity, that the horrifying truth became clear. He wasn't just allowing this to happen, he was enjoying it, reveling in it. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile trust that had once been the bedrock of their relationship. Mason, her husband, her partner, the man who had vowed to love and protect her, was not her savior in this nightmare. He was its architect. Aurora's world crumbled around her. The dares, the laughter, the touches, it all became a cacophony of betrayal. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a descent into something darker. A twisted abyss of power and submission. Of humiliation masquerading as intimacy. Her mind reeled, grasping for some semblance of sanity, of control. But there was none to be found. The night stretched before her like an endless void, each moment promising further degradation, further pain. The room seemed to hold its breath as the next dare was issued. It came from one of Mason's friends, the one who always seemed to relish pushing boundaries, toying with the limits of decency. His voice was thick with vulgarity, his words dripping with raw, unfiltered hunger. He dared Aurora to kneel before him, to take him into her mouth. The command hung in the air, a toxic fog of anticipation and dread. For a moment, time stood still. All eyes turned to her, their collective gaze a crushing weight. Aurora froze. This was different. This was more intimate, more degrading than anything that had come before. Her heart pounded furiously against her ribs. A wild, desperate rhythm that seemed to echo in the silence. Her eyes darted to Mason once more, seeking, begging, for a reprieve, for some indication that he would stop this madness. But what she saw instead was a subtle nod, a silent command that sealed her fate. Mason's expression was calm, almost serene, as if he were watching a particularly captivating performance. The nausea hit her like a tidal wave. But it was quickly overtaken by that same inexplicable mix of shame and exhilaration. Her knees buckled as she sank to the floor, her trembling hands resting on her thighs. The room became a blur of shadows and flickering light, the faces of the men around her distorted by the haze of alcohol and humiliation. She felt their eyes on her, burning into her skin, branding her with their desire. The moment was both sacred and profane, a grotesque tableau of power and submission that would haunt her forever. As she knelt there, Aurora realized that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The night had become a waking nightmare, a harrowing descent into a world she never imagined she would inhabit. And as she looked up at the man before her, his smirk a cruel reminder of her subjugation, she knew with chilling certainty that her life would never be the same again. As she engaged in the act, the atmosphere underwent a palpable transformation. What had once been light-hearted banter laced with teasing undertones now gave way to a heavier, more primal energy. The air thickened with unspoken tension, a dangerous current coursing through the room and electrifying the space. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the charged intimacy of the moment. The men's gazes sharpened, their eyes darkened with lust and a possessive hunger that could no longer be concealed. They reveled not only in the sight before them but in the intoxicating power they wielded over her, a power that was silently acknowledged yet left unchallenged. Each glance, every subtle shift in their posture, seemed to echo with the weight of unspoken desires, drawing her deeper into their world of shared yearning. One by one, they stepped forward, the boundary between restraint and indulgence dissolving. Each man approached with a singular intent, claiming his moment as if it were his birthright. Aurora, caught in the maelstrom of their collective passions, became more than herself. She was a vessel, an embodiment of their intertwined desires. And in her surrender, she became both an object of their longing and a mirror to their own unchecked impulses. The scene unfolded like a haunting melody, each note resonating with a blend of pleasure, possession, and vulnerability. The tension in the room pulsed like a living entity, weaving an intricate dance of dominance and submission, of giving and taking. And through it all, the echoes of what had been, the playful banter, the lightness, faded further into the shadows, replaced by a primal connection that both captivated and consumed them all. Aurora's mind drifted far from her body, as though it sought refuge in the distant void. She hovered above the scene, a silent and detached witness to her own descent into degradation. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating, leaving no room for coherent thought or the spark of rebellion. There was only the raw, primal act playing out, a tableau fueled by the guttural reactions of the men who leered and jeered. Their gazes pierced through her, reducing her to nothing more than a spectacle, a source of transient pleasure. She clawed at the remnants of her willpower, desperately clinging to a semblance of control, a flicker of dignity buried within her. But it was futile. Each turn, each moment eroded the fragile barriers she had built, stripping away her resistance layer by layer. The woman she had been, the devoted wife, the unique soul, seemed to recede further into a shadowed corner of her mind. What replaced her was something unfamiliar and alien, a creation molded by their hands and desires. She felt her identity fracturing, the pieces scattering into the void, leaving behind an empty vessel, a mere shell of the individual she once was. A chilling realization coursed through her veins, both paralyzing and perversely electrifying. It was as if she stood on the precipice of oblivion, staring into the abyss of submission that beckoned her. The men's voices became an overpowering chorus of vulgarity, their words sharp and merciless. Each crude comment was a chisel, carving away the final vestiges of her humanity. Their laughter echoed, their tones filled with triumph, as if they delighted not only in their power over her body but in their conquest of her very essence. In the whirlwind of sensations and sounds, Aurora teetered between fear and numbness, each emotion fighting for dominance. A shiver ran down her spine, an involuntary response to the dichotomy within her, fear of what she was becoming, yet an unsettling thrill at the surrender. The line between herself and the creature they shaped blurred until it seemed to disappear altogether. And in that fleeting moment, she realized that her battle was no longer external, it was a war waged within. A desperate struggle to hold on to the core of who she was amidst the chaos threatening to consume her. But Aurora was too far gone to muster any protest, too deeply ensnared in the intoxicating vortex of submission to summon even a whisper of dissent. She had become an object, stripped of autonomy, a plaything for their collective amusement. That stark reality, though inherently degrading, ignited a spark of forbidden exhilaration deep within her, an uncharted thrill that clashed violently with the moral compass she had clung to for so long. Her emotions were a maelstrom, a relentless storm where pleasure tangled with shame. Desire wove itself with disgust, and exhilaration danced alongside utter humiliation. The cacophony within her mind screamed for clarity, for reason. Yet she was powerless against the surge of conflicting sensations. How could she feel this way? How could she derive even an ounce of pleasure from something so dehumanizing? Yet she did. That realization, far from quelling her emotions, only heightened the intensity of the experience, pushing her further into the forbidden depths she never imagined herself capable of exploring. The shame that came with this recognition was suffocating, wrapping itself around her like a vice. Yet it also fed the fire of excitement that burned within. Every fiber of her being wrestled with the paradox, the undeniable allure of submission against the backdrop of a shattered self-image. Mason remained in the periphery, a silent sentinel, his presence more unsettling than any action he might have taken. His face was a mask, impassive and unreadable, concealing the tempest of emotions swirling within him. Yet Aurora could sense the darkness simmering behind his eyes, a twisted satisfaction that sent a chill rippling through her. It was as though he had been waiting for this, orchestrating it with his subtle silences, his unspoken approval, and his detached gaze. This was what he had wanted all along, wasn't it? The thought struck her with the force of a lightning bolt, illuminating the raw betrayal beneath the surface. His arousal was palpable, a silent admission that compounded her humiliation. The man she had trusted, who had promised to cherish her, had stood idly by as she was stripped of dignity and autonomy. Her heart raced, each beat a deafening drum in her ears as the weight of the night settled upon her. She had crossed an invisible boundary, a threshold that could never be undone. And yet, the shame was entwined with a perverse thrill, a forbidden allure that left her breathless. She had entered a world she didn't know existed, a shadowy realm of submission, degradation, and surrender that both terrified and intrigued her. The darkness within her, the part of herself she had always buried beneath layers of civility and control, had been unleashed. Now, she stood exposed, repulsed by her own powerlessness yet unable to deny the strange arousal that coursed through her veins. The night dragged on, a relentless cycle of submission and humiliation. Mason's friends, each one embodying a unique shade of depravity, took turns pushing Aurora further into the abyss. Her body betrayed her, responding to their touches despite the turmoil that ravaged her mind. The shame gnawed at her soul, leaving jagged edges where her sense of self once resided. She was no longer Aurora, the confident and composed woman who had entered that party hours before. She had been transformed into something else entirely, a vessel for their desires. A shadow of her former self. As the hours bled together, Aurora felt an eerie detachment from her own body, as though she were an observer watching the grotesque tableau unfold from a distance. Her shame, her fear, her unwilling arousal, they swirled together into an unholy cocktail of emotions that defied logic and reason. The realization struck her with the force of a tidal wave: the boundaries had been crossed. Shattered beyond repair. She had traversed the Rubicon of her relationship. And there was no turning back. The intoxicating pull of forbidden desires was an unrelenting force, dragging her further into the depths of this new reality. Finally, Aurora stumbled into the sanctuary of the bathroom, her trembling hands fumbling with the lock until the door clicked shut behind her. The sound reverberated in the silent room, carrying with it an air of finality. The harsh fluorescent light illuminated the reflection staring back at her from the mirror, a distorted image of someone she barely recognized. The woman she had been was gone, replaced by a fragmented shadow of her former self. Her wide, haunted eyes searched the mirror for answers, for a trace of the person she once was. But all she saw was the evidence of her degradation etched across her face. An indelible mark of the night's events. The phantom touch of their hands lingered on her skin, a ghostly reminder of their violation. Their hungry, mocking gazes seared into her memory, each one a dagger to her dwindling sense of self. And then there was Mason, the man she had once called her protector. He had stood by, a complicit observer, his silence a weapon that cut deeper than any spoken word. His tacit approval, his voyeuristic satisfaction, was a betrayal that left her reeling. She splashed cold water onto her face, the icy sting a desperate attempt to cleanse herself of their touch, to erase the shame that clung to her like a second skin. But the water offered no solace. It mingled with her tears, cascading down her cheeks like rivers of regret and despair. In that moment, Aurora knew she could never return to the woman she had been. The events of the night had altered her irrevocably, leaving behind a fractured soul grappling with the weight of forbidden desires and unbearable shame. The bathroom was her temporary refuge, a fragile shield against the storm raging outside. But even here, she couldn't escape the darkness within. It loomed over her, a constant reminder of the choices she had made and the ones forced upon her. And as she stood there, staring into the hollow eyes of her reflection, Aurora understood one harrowing truth: there was no undoing what had been done. No escape from the abyss she had willingly, or unwillingly, entered. The woman she had been was lost. And in her place stood someone she barely recognized, a stranger forged in the crucible of submission and shame. The tears cascading down Aurora's cheeks bore silent witness to a profound and irreversible transformation, one that had reshaped her very existence. Each droplet mirrored the weight of her choices, the inescapable reality of a path she could neither rewrite nor escape. What had led her to this moment seemed like a distant memory, blurred by the haze of emotions now swirling within her. Yet, as she stepped back into the dimly lit room, the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The air had grown heavier, laden with an insatiable tension that seemed to press down on her with an almost tangible force. The gazes that met hers were no longer masked by civility or pretense. Instead, they burned with an unfiltered intensity, a raw hunger that sent shivers racing across her skin. She could feel their collective desire, primal, unrelenting, and utterly consuming. They had tasted the essence of her submission. And now they yearned for more. Their appetites unquenchable. Mason, her husband, remained rooted in his seat, a silent sentinel to her unraveling. His dark, penetrating eyes betrayed his satisfaction, gleaming with a dangerous blend of approval and arousal. Though his lips never moved, his silence spoke volumes, endorsing the twisted spectacle before him. His presence loomed like a shadow, both a source of judgment and a testament to his complicity. He reveled in her debasement, his stoicism only magnifying the depth of his distorted desires. The men, emboldened by the cracks in her resolve, shed the last remnants of decorum. Their restraint, a fragile facade, had crumbled entirely. What remained was an unvarnished, primal hunger that demanded to be sated. Their words, sharp and laden with entitlement, sliced through the heavy air, commanding and coaxing her further into the depths of submission. Aurora could feel their power over her, as though it were a chain wrapped tightly around her will. Her body moved on instinct, a vessel detached from her numbed mind. Each command they issued, each act they demanded, dragged her further down into an abyss she had never imagined. It was a spiral, a dizzying descent where shame intertwined with an inexplicable, forbidden pleasure that she couldn't deny. Every step, every surrender, chipped away at the woman she once was, leaving her suspended in a liminal space between guilt and yearning. The room pulsed with an almost primal energy, its boundaries now defined by dominance and submission. Aurora's compliance fed their fervor, fueling a cycle of indulgence and degradation that seemed without end. Her tears, though silent, carried a chorus of unspoken emotions: regret, fear, defiance, and an unsettling acceptance of the storm consuming her. Yet beneath the surface of her despair, something deeper stirred, a quiet rebellion or perhaps a resigned understanding that there was no turning back. This was her reality now, her new existence shaped by the choices she could no longer undo. She was a puppet, her every move dictated by strings pulled taut by their insatiable desires. Her autonomy unraveling thread by thread in the intoxicating haze of submission. Her own will, fragile as a whisper in a storm, dissolved into the oppressive atmosphere that enveloped her. It was not merely compliance, it was an erasure of self, a surrender to forces she neither sought nor understood. Then, the competition began. Mason's friends, emboldened by their shared hunger for domination, transformed their lecherous intentions into a perverse spectacle. Their camaraderie mutated into rivalry as they vied for her attention, their egos feeding off the conquest they imagined her to be. Aurora, in their warped perspective, ceased to be a person. She became an object, stripped of dignity and individuality, reduced to a trophy to parade their power. Every fleeting moment of her discomfort, every crack in her composure, became a twisted source of their collective satisfaction. The shame that coursed through her veins was unbearable, a heavy, suffocating weight. Yet even amidst the torrent of humiliation, her body, treacherous and unbidden, betrayed her. It responded to their invasive touch with a forbidden arousal that both repulsed and confused her. The sharp contrast between disgust and a reluctant thrill slicing through her like a blade. This betrayal amplified her torment, trapping her in a merciless cycle where degradation fed desire, and desire reinforced her degradation. It was a prison without walls, constructed from invisible chains that tightened with every passing second. One of them, his voice dripping with sinister intent, suggested taking their debased game further. His words hung in the air like poison, the implications seeping into her mind and igniting a cold fire of terror. The room seemed to close in on her, her breaths shallow and rapid, her chest tightening under the weight of impending violation. Aurora's breath hitched, a gasp escaping her lips as a wave of dread crashed over her, leaving her trembling and paralyzed. She wanted to scream, to shatter the silence with a cry of defiance, to claw her way out of their reach, to reclaim the agency they had stolen from her. But her body, locked in the cruel grip of fear and betrayal, refused to respond. Her limbs felt leaden, her voice imprisoned within her throat, her pleas dying before they could be born. She stood there, a silent participant in her own undoing, caught in the crossfire of their depravity and her own fragile humanity. They led her toward the bedroom, a shadowed sanctuary that exuded both menace and intimacy, its oppressive stillness thick with unspoken intent. The room felt alive, as if it bore witness to countless whispered confessions and veiled sins. And now, it seemed to conspire against her. The bed loomed ahead, an imposing, ominous figure in the dim light, a grotesque altar of surrender upon which she was to be offered. Stripped of agency and pride, it stood as a stark reminder, not only of what she had already lost but of the devastation still to come. A foreboding monument to her unraveling. As they moved her closer, her steps faltered, each one heavier than the last. A visceral premonition coiled around her, squeezing like a vice around her chest. It was a chilling awareness, an instinctive understanding that she was teetering on the precipice of an abyss, staring into the cold, unrelenting void of her own helplessness. The air grew suffocating, as though the room itself was complicit in her undoing. Aurora felt their eyes on her, predatory and unyielding, peeling back the fragile layers of her dignity with every passing second. Their gazes burned like firebrands, branding her with shame, forcing her to confront the crumbling facade of resistance she had clung to so desperately. It wasn't just the physical proximity that shattered her resolve, it was the relentless weight of their collective intention, pressing down on her like an invisible, unbearable force. One by one, they took their turns, each man wielding his dominance as a weapon to erode the walls she had built around herself. Their actions were a cruel symphony of control, each movement designed to push her further, to test her boundaries until they ceased to exist. Every act felt like a betrayal, not only of her body but of the small fragments of hope she still carried within her. She fought to maintain some semblance of composure, to hold on to a flicker of who she once was. But the struggle felt futile. With each passing moment, she could feel herself slipping further, the person she had been dissolving into the abyss of their desires. Her mind churned in a relentless storm of confusion and despair, her thoughts colliding like waves against jagged rocks. She couldn't discern where her will ended and theirs began. Her body moved like a marionette, controlled by strings she couldn't sever, a pawn in their dark game. Her own sense of self felt like a distant echo, fading further with each act of submission. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls closing in, suffused with the oppressive weight of her humiliation. From the doorway, Mason stood, a specter of silent complicity. His presence was a shadow that stretched long and dark, a reminder that there was no escape, no reprieve from the torment. His eyes were fixed on her, heavy with the cruel pleasure he derived from her degradation. He didn't need to speak, his silence was louder than any word, a resounding testament to his approval of her suffering. The glint of arousal in his gaze was a dagger to her soul. A cruel confirmation of his betrayal and the twisted depths of his desire. And so, she endured. She bore the weight of their actions, the sting of her own helplessness, and the agonizing realization that she was utterly alone in her pain. The room bore witness, its shadows soaking in her anguish, its silence amplifying her cries. And as the night stretched on, Aurora felt herself unraveling, piece by piece, until all that remained was the hollow shell of a woman who had once dared to hope. Aurora was no longer herself. She had been stripped of her identity, her will, and the quiet strength that once defined her. Now, she was lost, shattered into fragments. A mere shadow of the vibrant woman she used to be. The weight of their collective violation bore down on her soul, grinding her spirit into a fine dust that scattered into the void of despair. The echoes of her former life felt distant, unreachable, like a dream fading in the harsh light of morning. She had been reduced to something hollow, empty, a shell left behind after the storm. As the endless hours of the night crawled by, the grim and inescapable truth settled upon her like a suffocating fog. There would be no rescue, no last-minute reprieve. There was no hand to pull her from this abyss into which she had been thrust. The descent was complete, her path irrevocably altered by forces she could neither fight nor escape. Her degradation had swallowed her whole, leaving her a captive not only to the cruelty of others but also to the agonizing betrayal of the one person she had trusted most. Mason, her husband, her betrayer. He loomed in the corner of the room like a shadow made flesh, the silent warden of her misery. His presence was more oppressive than the darkness that surrounded them, his gaze piercing and unrelenting. There was no pity in his eyes, no trace of the man she once loved. Instead, there was only cold, calculating satisfaction, a darkness that gleamed with a twisted joy at her undoing. He had orchestrated every step of this nightmare, pulling the strings that bound her to this torment. And now he stood back, watching as the chaos he had unleashed consumed her entirely. Aurora's mind raced, fragments of thoughts clashing against each other as she tried in vain to make sense of the betrayal. How had it come to this? How had she missed the signs, ignored the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the silences that stretched too long, the moment she had stepped into this den of vipers? Her fate had been sealed. She should have seen it then, the gleaming eyes, the predatory smiles, the suffocating air thick with unspoken intentions. But foresight was a luxury she no longer possessed, lost alongside her dignity, her power, and her very sense of self. The atmosphere in the room was unbearable. The tension was not just palpable, it was alive. A crackling force that pressed against her skin and stole the air from her lungs. Mason's friends, the architects of her torment, exchanged glances laced with dark amusement and unspoken agreement. They had been circling, waiting, savoring the unraveling of her resistance. This was the moment they had been building toward, the culmination of their depravity, a final act that would leave no doubt of her complete submission. Their hunger was unrelenting, their greed insatiable. Aurora could feel it radiating off them like heat, burning her with its intensity. Their hands moved without hesitation, driven by desires that knew no bounds, desires that had long since crossed the threshold of humanity. Their eyes, alight with a terrifying fervor, bore into her as if she were no longer a person but an object to be claimed and discarded. The room became a cage, every shadow a wall, every breath a reminder of her entrapment. Aurora's world had collapsed into this singular, excruciating moment. The woman she had been was gone, consumed by the darkness that surrounded her. And as the night dragged on, she realized there was no escaping it. There was no redemption to be found here. No light to guide her back. She was a prisoner. Not just of their malice, but of the choices and betrayals that had led her to this place. And Mason, the man she had once called her partner, stood silently, watching as the last flicker of her spirit was extinguished. His satisfaction chilling and absolute. Aurora's body trembled under the relentless cascade of sensations. As if she were caught in a storm she could neither resist nor control. Each touch, each movement, drew her further into an abyss where reason dissolved and raw emotion reigned supreme. For a fleeting moment, a thought flickered in the haze of her mind, a question both profound and unsettling. Was this what it truly meant to lose oneself entirely? To surrender so completely that her identity faded, leaving her as nothing more than a vessel for the desires of others. Her thoughts, once sharp and coherent, now fragmented like shards of glass scattered in chaos. They swirled in her mind, indistinct and elusive, leaving her grasping for clarity in a whirlwind of confusion. Her senses, however, were painfully acute, every nerve alive with intensity as they took their turns with her. Each movement was deliberate, yet overwhelming, their bodies pressing against hers with a heat that seemed to scorch her very soul. Hands roamed her exposed skin with a hunger that left no part of her untouched, no inch unclaimed. She could feel every whisper of breath, every graze of fingertips, imprinted upon her like a map of vulnerability. Time seemed to lose meaning, stretching and collapsing all at once, as she teetered on the edge of oblivion. Aurora's surrender was not merely physical, it was the kind of yielding that reached deep into the core of her being, stripping away her defenses, her sense of control. Aurora's body reacted instinctively, a raw betrayal of the storm raging within her soul. Each sensation crashed over her like relentless waves, drowning her in the overwhelming intensity of the moment. The degradation she endured reached its apex, an unbearable crescendo that stripped away her defenses. In that harrowing instant, a chilling clarity settled upon her. She had surrendered all semblance of control. She was no longer her own master but a marionette, her strings manipulated by the voracious appetites of others. Her will, once strong and unyielding, now echoed faintly in the chaotic symphony of their unrelenting desires. There was no retreat, no path to reclaim the woman she once was. As the night dragged on, their actions became increasingly feral, their demands growing more ruthless, pushing her deeper into the void of submission. Each aggressive act carved away at her identity, reducing her to a mere shadow of the person she had been. Aurora's emotions swung wildly, an unbearable blend of conflicting sensations, a toxic mixture of humiliation and perverse pleasure. A disorienting waltz between fleeting arousal and crushing despair. With every passing moment, her sense of self dissolved further, fragmenting into unrecognizable pieces. Memories of who she had been, her dreams, her strength, her dignity, faded into a distant haze. All that remained was a hollow vessel, emptied of its essence, stripped of its vitality. She was adrift, lost in the abyss, a silent witness to her own unraveling. Yet even in this void, a faint spark flickered, a fragile remnant of the person she had once been. Buried but not entirely extinguished. And then, amidst the swirling chaos and cacophony of the night, Mason stepped forth from the shadows with a presence that sent a shiver through Aurora's already fragile resolve. He moved with the deliberate precision of a predator stalking its wounded prey. his silhouette framed by the dim, flickering light. Aurora's breath hitched as her eyes met his, searching desperately for some trace of the man she once knew, the man she had loved and trusted. But what she saw in his gaze was something unrecognizable, a darkness she had never fathomed. As he joined the fray, his touch sent a jolt through her, a cruel paradox of familiarity and alienation. That once comforting presence, the one she had leaned on during countless storms, now felt like an invasive force, driving her deeper into the abyss. Strangely, she felt a twisted sense of relief at his arrival. Yet this relief was poisoned by the bitter realization that the man who had once vowed to shield her from harm was now complicit in her undoing. The betrayal struck her like a physical blow, each moment stripping away the fragile layers of trust and love that had bound them. The irony was suffocating, a knife twisting cruelly in a wound that refused to close. Mason, the one who had once stood before her as a symbol of unwavering devotion, was now an agent of her humiliation. His presence did not ease her suffering, it magnified it, embedding it into her very soul. The room, filled with frenzied movements and taunting voices, seemed to collapse in on itself, each passing second dragging her further into an unrelenting nightmare. As the hours wore on, the frenetic energy of the night began to falter, giving way to an oppressive stillness. The room, once alive with manic, insatiable desire, now felt hollow, a space devoid of humanity. Aurora lay motionless on the bed, her body a map of bruises and marks, each one a testament to the violation she had endured. Her mind, once a sanctuary of memories and dreams, now resembled a shattered mosaic, fragments of herself scattered beyond repair. She could feel the weight of her submission pressing down on her, a suffocating reminder of what she had become. The events of the night replayed relentlessly in her mind, each memory more harrowing than the last. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and the enormity of that truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket. The laughter and crude remarks that had echoed so cruelly throughout the room finally began to fade as Mason's friends departed one by one. Their smug expressions and satisfied smirks left behind a lingering stench of triumph, a reminder of her complete and utter degradation. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath Mason's footsteps as he approached her. Aurora forced herself to meet his gaze, though her heart felt as though it might shatter under the weight of what she saw. His eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction, his expression a stark contrast to the man who had once smiled at her with genuine affection. There was no trace of tenderness now, only a slow, deliberate smile, a cruel mockery of the love they had once shared. In that moment, Aurora understood the full extent of her loss. This was no longer the man she had married. He had become a stranger, and she had become his possession, a hollow shell to be used and discarded at his whim. The weight of her submission bore down on her with a suffocating finality, an invisible shroud that robbed her of breath and stole the remnants of who she had been. Every fiber of her being ached with the crushing realization of what she had become. The fragile pieces of her identity shattered and scattered, impossible to piece back together. The room was cloaked in a heavy silence, the echoes of their laughter and crude, mocking remarks fading like shadows retreating from the dying light. One by one, Mason's friends filed out, their smirking faces carrying the imprint of smug satisfaction, their predatory desires sated. The door clicked shut behind the last of them, leaving the air thick with the weight of what had transpired. Mason's slow, deliberate footsteps approached, each step a drumbeat of impending torment. His eyes gleamed with a dark, predatory satisfaction as he surveyed the wreckage he had so meticulously orchestrated. Aurora sat motionless, her body trembling, though whether from cold, fear, or the crushing despair that now consumed her, she could not tell. Her eyes met his, those same eyes she had once sought solace in. Eyes that now reflected only cruelty and conquest. Her heart, once brimming with hope and trust, now felt leaden, its rhythm echoing the unbearable truth that this night had irrevocably rewritten the story of their lives. The woman she had been, the vibrant, independent soul who had once dared to dream and love, was gone. In her place was a shadow of a person, her spirit fractured, her sense of self buried under the weight of submission. She was no longer Aurora, not the Aurora she had known or anyone she could recognize. She was his now, wholly and utterly, a possession to be wielded, a puppet bound to his whims. Mason's smile was deliberate, slow, and steeped in malice, a cruel mockery of the love they had once shared. It twisted his handsome features into a mask of dominance, reminding her with brutal clarity that he had won. He stood over her, triumphant, as if surveying the spoils of his victory. Aurora felt the finality of it sink into her bones. There would be no returning to what they once were. Whatever flicker of tenderness or connection had once existed between them had been snuffed out, replaced by a darkness that consumed them both. Her submission was complete, her spirit broken beyond repair. She could no longer summon the strength to resist or even to hope for escape. The realization descended upon her like an oppressive fog, smothering the last fragile embers of the woman she had been. Every memory of her former self, her laughter, her dreams, her resilience, felt distant and unattainable, like a melody she could no longer recall. Thank you for reading. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me in discovering many exciting things in the upcoming videos.